sleep about now. So the topic is, for today's lecture, is George Washington's sense of humor. And it's an interesting topic because I didn't know what to expect when I got into it. I approached it from the aspect of Abraham Lincoln's sense of humor, which we have all heard about. And it's one of the neater lectures I'd like to give. So neat that I'm actually sneaking it in this year into the cycle. I'll give a talk later in the year on Abraham Lincoln's sense of humor, even though he had absolutely little to do with the state of New Jersey. Abraham Lincoln never stayed in New Jersey one night, living or dead. When the funeral train went through, it just went from New York to Philadelphia. And Mary Todd, his wife, used to vacation at the beach. But Lincoln had very little to do with New Jersey, but I'm just sneaking it in. Good topic. Lincoln is used, we know, and this is for comparison, what we know about Lincoln versus George. Used it to overcome his depression, to win people's attention. When he was on the law circuit, he tried to entertain and persuade the juries. In his politics, he used it to either illustrate points or to draw attention away from different points. And also he had a quick mind. So humor was a very key part of Abraham Lincoln's life. And there's a book called Abraham Lincoln's Humor. It has over 300 anecdotes. And my favorite one with Lincoln, he was driving around Washington with Secretary Stanton, or when he was secretary. Somehow the topic came up on the area of a circle is, I think if I remember my high school math, pi r squared. And Lincoln perks up and said, pi r not square, pi r round. Okay, and that's just the kind of instant humor he would do. And supposedly he would, when he read something or heard something, jot it on a piece of paper and put it in his famous hat and put them together. This is not the way George operated. Okay, so I got the idea of doing a book on George Washington, and I did luckily happen across a book called George Washington Laughing. And the importance of that is to look at George Washington's character, but more so how his memory has been preserved. In that we're all human, we all have anger, we all have gladness, we all have humor of some sort. It doesn't always get preserved or presented down. I like to include it in my talks just because I find some things humorous. And George Washington, as we remember him, seems to be a statue-like. There's a book on him called The Marble Man. How did that develop? Okay, so I went through Zoll's book on Washington's humor. He only has 100 anecdotes to share with, as opposed to 300 in his book for Lincoln. I'll be citing 23 of these, and then let you form your own opinion on what George's humor was. Now, he was naturally reticent. He wanted to be like Cicero, the Roman politician, or Socrates, the Greek philosopher. He was just naturally that way. It comes through. And his contemporaries recognized his dignity, and the artists always show him as stern-faced and dour. Now, whether that's related to wooden teeth or elephant or whatever kind of teeth he had in his mouth, but it's the nature of the art. Also, when they did these face mask things, Lincoln, I think I may mention it, he almost suffocated to death when they put the plaster on your face and let it harden and put straws up your nose so you could breathe, and it almost backfired on him. Those tend to be, because you can't be smiling for 10 minutes while a plaster's setting. So our visions of him and the paintings of him always having stern looking, and we also don't really think of him as in the different stages of his life. When he was a younger man and working as a surveyor in Western Virginia, he was quite active. He's a big guy, I think reddish type hair, and that here at the Battle of Monmouth, he was 46 years old. He's not like the guy you see on the dollar bill with a white wig and drawn in face. I mean, he was an active guy. I'll be talking more about that. So art tends to show him as serious looking because that's how they saw him in old age, because he wasn't famous when he was younger. They didn't get a lot of portraits done of him. What the main evidence will be from written work. Now, what's interesting is the way his written work got preserved. He knew after the Revolution that he was becoming, or was becoming a famous guy. And he hired a guy named Richard Varick to edit his papers. All the orders that he sent out while he was running the army, they kept copies of them. That's one of Alexander Hamilton's jobs when he was on Washington's staff, was to keep an order book. His letters, he kept copies of. They didn't have Xerox machines, so they had guys with good writing that would copy over these letters. And Washington saved everything, and he reviewed it through. And the Papers of George Washington Project, I forget what publishing company or library furnished them, has been busy comparing what we have of the original letters with what got published. And what happened was that the first editor, Mr. Varick, deliberately edited the papers to take out things that looked humorous. For example, General Israel Putnam was a minor general in the war. Washington called him Old Put. Okay, now that doesn't sound obscene or anything, he just called him Old Put. When the editor went through Washington's papers, he changed every time he saw Old Put to General Putnam. Took the humor out. Okay, so, and that Washington knew that was going on in the 1780s. And as comparison then with Lincoln, who was always seeking out new jokes and shared them with everybody, Washington's contemporaries did not save his jokes because they wanted him to appear like Cicero or Socrates, because he's the father of our country. And our father of our country should not be a humorist. So they were also buying into this image. The early biographies of General Washington, President Washington, also expunged deliberately aspects of his humor. One historian wrote, the early biographies of George Washington, Parson Weems, Washington Irving, Mr. Lossing, Sparks, even Douglas Southall Freeman in the 1900s, all rejected any anecdotes that would in their thinking cast a contrary reflection on his image. This was done not to diminish his image as a human being, but rather to place him above the common man. They were writing about an icon. They wanted to deify him. They had a different theory of biographies in those days, more like Plutarch in Roman days, or they wanted to show what Washington was like. You hear the story of the cherry tree. He told a cherry tree got chopped down supposedly, and George said to his father, I cannot tell a lie, I did it. Never happened. It's there to show his character. Just as the stories of Abraham Lincoln returning overdue library books in the snowstorm. Didn't happen. It's there to show his character. They have this Washington story of him throwing $1 across the Rappahannock River. Okay. They had Bob Feller, some famous baseball player, went down there. It's impossible to do. But if George Washington did it, he must have been a super guy. Okay. So they didn't have trouble, just like with Plutarch and back in Roman days, of stretching the truth in order to show character. Anyway, I'm digressing there. The modern biographers, including the strong, I'm not really up on the one since Douglas Freeman, called him the Marble Man, and made him appear not to have all these human traits of anger and comedy. An extreme example, the financier J.P. Morgan had a large collection of original Washington letters and material. He had his secretary burn them, the ones that had language that didn't seem proper. What? Burning? Imagine burning Washington papers or Lincoln papers? Although Mary Todd Lincoln, I think, burned his love letters. But when the secretary was asked why they were burning priceless letters, the secretary said, why not? Mr. Morgan can afford it. But that doesn't help us as historians trying to figure out what his real character was like. So I'll leave you, again, as we go through these examples that we have preserved, not from his own papers, because the humor got expunged, is that the right legal term, from his papers, but from people that knew him at the time. I would like to think that being human, he did have a sense of humor. And take the flip side of that, did he have a sense of anger? Yes, he did. He showed it right here at the battlefield. The morning of the battle, George Washington was not on the field. He didn't reach the battle. He was over at Gravel Hill in Monroe. He reached the field around noon, and he ran into General Charles Lee, whom he had sent in command of the advanced forces, who was getting defeated on the field, and ran into him over near One Rock Road here inside the park, and asked Lee, according to the official versions, "Sir, what is all this confusion?" And then supposedly yelled at Lee, even maybe swore until the leaves on the trees were shaking. I don't think he said, "Sir, what is all this confusion?" I think he said, "What the hell's going on here, Lee?" That seems more appropriate to the point. Our Victorian ancestors would not say that George would swear. I would point out, and those of you who heard my talks before are familiar with this, that George was a Virginia fox hunter, loved to go fox hunting. He grew up in a polite society, but on the edge of it. He inherited Mount Vernon from his brother Lawrence. He spent his critical teen years as surveyor in what was the Wild West of those days, Western Virginia and Maryland. I propose that George Washington knew how to swear fluently in several different foreign languages from what his upbringing was, but that's not preserved in the literature. The following anecdote is by none other than Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln heard or told the story that a guy named Tom met an old man in Alexandria who knew George Washington and told him that George often swore. Now, Tom's father had held the father of our country up as a faultless person and told his son to follow in his footsteps. "Well," said Tom, "when I heard that George Washington was addicted to the vices and infirmities of man, I felt so relieved that I shouted for joy." That George wasn't a marvel man. He was human and had anger and could swear. So my argument will be that if he showed anger, like he did to Charles Lee here on the battlefield, if he was able to swear at any general he wanted on his staff, and when he was out hunting foxes, then the third emotion would be humor that he should have. "Molly, I'm sorry, I ran your bones over there. Dog time out. Molly, where's your bone? Okay. See, you want it now because Daddy wanted it. Yeah, see? Yeah, okay. Okay. So, back to the original sources on George's humor. David Humphreys was George's secretary and an early biographer. He wrote in 1788 that grave and majestic as he ordinarily was in his deportment, he occasionally not only relished wit and humor in others, but displayed an inconsiderable share of humor himself. The secretary said, notwithstanding Washington's temper, and he was more known for his temper than his humor, is a rather serious cast, and his countenance commonly carries the impression of thoughtfulness. Okay, he perfectly relishes a pleasant story and a bit of wit or a burlesque description which surprises by its incongruity. David Howell, a Rhode Island politician, wrote in 1783 that George had a pleasant smile and a sparkling vivacity of wit and humor. Okay, I can go for the smile, but vivacity of wit and humor might be a bit of overstatement. You'll see his form your own opinion as we move on. Earliest example of a joke by him is in 1755, when he's in his mid-20s. He was a colonel out with General Braddock out in the West then, and he's lucky he kept his job because Braddock got ambushed and killed out at Fort Necessity. Washington wrote to his brother, "As I have heard since my arrival in this place, a circumstantial account of my death and my dying speech. It was reported in the papers he'd been killed in this battle. It wasn't he that was killed, it was General Braddock. I take this early opportunity of contradicting the first and assuring you that I have yet to compose the latter. Or, was it Lincoln or Mark Twain that said that, the rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated? During the war, Alexander Hamilton was a secretary for a couple of years. He was often late. He was a young guy. He liked to go partying with John Lawrence and some of the other staff members. And one time when he showed up late, Washington told Hamilton, quote, "You must provide yourself with a new watch or I get a new secretary." That is to the point. When Congress was not raising enough money to support the Army, the President of Congress, Elias Boudinot, said, "Mr. Robert Morris, an important financier in Philadelphia, has his hands full." And George said on the side, "I wish he had his pockets full also." So he has a sense of humor. It may be off the cuff or a little blunt, but that's where it was. At the Morristown encampment up in North Jersey later in the war, Washington bought a very spirited horse. One of his junior officers boasted of his horsemanship and volunteered to break in the animal. No sooner had he mounted the horse when he was thrown head over heels to the ground. Washington was so amused by the sight that, quote, "he was convulsed with laughter and tears ran down his cheeks." Okay, you try to ride my horse, guy. Ha, I told you couldn't. Molly, where are you going? Why don't you go see Matt? You like Matt. Matt, would you call her?
Molly.
Thank you, Matt. 1773, at a marriage ceremony, George said to his friend, "Mentioning of a wedding puts me in mind of another. This is the marriage of Mr. Henderson of Colchester to a Miss Moore of the same place. She was remarkable for her frizzled hair and good singing voice." The latter of which, I presume, is what captivated him, not the frizzy hair. Battle of Monmouth. Another anecdote from here. After yelling at Lee and then putting him back in charge for a little while, Washington said to Lee, "What is the reason of this extraordinary retreat?" Or again, "What the hell's going on here?" According to one witness, Lee replied, "My troops will not fight the British Grenadiers," to which Washington replied, "Sir, you didn't even try." Yeah. Great story with a pointed remark, but that's what he seems to have been good at. Did Molly just wander out the door, Matt?
I'm going to go find her.
Thank you. General David Cobb, one of George's aides, says he heard George laugh heartily only twice during the entire war. One occurred at a card game in Virginia. George Washington and General Cobb were teamed against a preacher and a doctor in a game of whist. Now, whist, I think, is an early form of bridge. I used to try to play it in college. It was more like bridge with no bidding or something, but it was popular in those days. The preacher was playing awful, and the doctor, his partner, gave out a strong string of expletives. The preacher threw his cards down and wouldn't play anymore. The doctor apologized. The preacher continued to play badly. When the game was over, the doctor ran to a chimney and threw his head inside it and let forth a nasty volley of foul oaths. The effect was irresistible, and George Washington threw himself back in his chair and laughed till the tears rolled out of his eyes. Okay, second mention of that, him laughing so hard he would cry. This one I can't quite figure, this one is a carriage story. It route from Philadelphia to Baltimore with Mrs. Washington in a carriage after the war. The driver fell asleep and the carriage hit a bump and fell on its side. That is scary. They didn't have railroads in those days, okay? And the carriages, it's just amazing. They're like these stagecoaches. Now, we all see the cowboy shows. I love watching Gunsmoke. With these carriages, the springs were awful. There's no screens. There's bugs. They're bumpy. If you have to go to the bathroom, you have to ask the driver to stop so you can go off to the side of the road. When they reached a stream, usually you had to get out so that they could take the stagecoach or the wagon across the stream. You get wet crossing and then you get back in. When I talk about Alexander Hamilton had, how shall I put this, a frail intestinal system. And just going from New York to Philadelphia, he had to ask the driver to stop 5 times so he could relieve himself. And that's embarrassing. Okay. So George the driver fell asleep. The carriage hit a bump and fell over. Imagine George Washington and Mrs. Washington inside a carriage when it fell over. No one got hurt. George crawled out a window This is George Washington, the father of our country. You wouldn't have heard these stories if I hadn't looked through these books before. And yelled at the driver, who was still asleep, "You rascal, you upset the carriage." The driver woke up and saw the scene and, being scared, hid under one of the horses. "Yes, Your Excellency, the road is bad, but I will make up the time." And George replied, "How will we go on with the chariot upset and you hiding under the horse?" The scene became so exceeding ludicrous that Mrs. Washington laughed outright, in which she was joined by the other members of the carriage, by the servants, by some of the neighbors who came by, and at length Washington started laughing. The carriage is on its side. The driver just woke up, doesn't know what he's going to do. He's embarrassed. What's he going to do, run off in the woods and leave George and the whole thing there? So anyway, it worked out, but it was a humorous situation, but he was the last one to chime in with the laughing. Henry Lee was a different Lee from down in Virginia. One day Washington was at a table, and he mentioned he needed some carriage horses and asked his guest, Henry Lee, if he knew where he could get some carriage horses. Lee replied, "I have a pair, General, but you cannot get them." "Why not?" said the general. Lee said, "Because you will never pay more than half the price for anything, and I must have full price for my horses." The bantering set Mrs. Washington laughing. And her parrot, I didn't know the Washingtons had a parrot, which was sitting beside her, joined in the laughter. And the general said, "Ah, Lee, you are a funny fellow. See, even the bird is laughing at you." Mrs. Washington kept a parrot in Mount Vernon. I didn't know that. And I'll just pause for a moment to talk about his whole relationship with her. Why did George marry Martha, who was a widow with 2 kids? I asked this of my history students with the high school I teach. Why would George marry a dumpy, older woman widow with 2 kids? Easy answer. Richest widow in Virginia, sir. But they did grow to love each other. Very much so. But as I put a button in it, they had no children. Now, it can't be Mrs. Washington's doing because she had children. He didn't. And current thinking is that when his brother John was, before he died, sick with something or other, they went down to the Bahamas or somewhere because the climate was be better. And George got a mild case of smallpox, which affected his face. It doesn't show up in the portraits because they respected him and didn't want to. Might have also made him sterile. And this longer range had an important aspect to our country's history. Because not only was George Washington a strong leader, he had no sons to take over after him and set up a dynasty, which made him be even more so a great choice for the first president. Because they didn't have to fear that, like Oliver Cromwell or characters over in England or other countries, that you're getting rid of one king to bring in another. And that's just the way his health went, and that's the current interpretation of that. But anyway, backing up, Mrs. Washington had brought out the softer side in him. But just imagine George living in Mount Vernon with a parrot hanging around. And my nephew had a parrot, and the dang bird, they kept it near the kitchen, so every time the phone rang, the parrot would go, ring, 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 hello, ring, ring, ring. And it got to the point that they couldn't tell which was the phone and which was the parrot. So I've never had one myself. I have no desire to. I like dogs, as you can see. But that just brings out more the human side of him. This is the one about the plaster cast, the face mask. Artists were always asking to make busts of him, and the way they would do so was to have you lie flat and put plaster over your face. He recalled that they oiled my features and placed me flat on my back on a cot, proceeded to daub my face with the plaster. In this mode, Mrs. Washington came into the room, seeing him thus overcovered with plaster, and she exclaimed, "Oh!" And her cry excited me in the disposition to smile, which gave my mouth a slight twist, compressed my lips, and it's barely observable in the plaster that this artist, Mr. Wright, made. So there's at least one plaster cast around where George was trying to smile, because Martha came in and laughed at him, really. She probably laughed at her with all the makeup that ladies put with the clay and everything on their faces. Well, now he's got it on. This is another bust story, but not quite so humorous. concerning the Houdon bust that's in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. It is said that Washington came near losing his life, as I mentioned earlier in the making of this bust. He had laid down on the table to have the plaster cast taken with a little tobacco in his mouth, not smart, and came near strangling himself to death. Fortunately not. Now, these are the strange stories that I'm still trying to figure out. Pardon me if I get a drink for a second. Okay. Boston, March 1776. He received information that the British were finally leaving. I've mentioned before, if you've been on my other talks, Washington did not have a great record as an army commander. 4 wins, 8 losses, 1 tie. The tie here is Monmouth. The 2 wins are the sieges at Boston in 1775 and at Yorktown in 1781. The other 2 wins were what I call the sneak attacks at Princeton and Trenton. Other than that, he didn't do too well. Partly his fault as over-planning, partly the fault of the American troops, partly the fault of the American sub-commanders. And I'll be talking about that later this year when we look at George as a field commander. But anyway, General Greene was visiting his headquarters there in Boston. The British were leaving and he needed to go in the field. So he yelled for his barber to get his wig, because a good general can't go out and lead the troops without his wig on. Right? Right, okay. Bring my wig, you rascal, said General Greene. And another general diverted the company at Greene's expense, saying, your wig is where it should be. Your wig, is behind the looking glass. At which Greene raised his eyes, looked at the mirror, and he had the wig on, and he didn't realize it. Washington, in a fit of laughter, threw himself on the floor to laugh. Now, I'm going to give you 1 or 2 more incidents that will tell of George Washington rolling on the floor in laughter. I have trouble envisioning that. Now, there's 2 options on this that he really did. And I've been looking through literature to see if there's other accounts of people in the 1700s rolling on the floor in laughter. But I will cite to you as an example, and this is from the times of Lincoln. When Lincoln says, pi are not square, pi are round, knee slapping funny. And we will still use that term. The joke is knee slapping funny, but nobody slaps their knees anymore. But they used to. So does this mean then that George is really rolling on the ground in laughter? Or that at some point in American history, some group used that as an idiom for something being really funny? And the more I talk about it, I think it's more an idiom rather than actually happening. But there are several incidents citing George Washington rolling on the floor in laughter. But I think more of this knee-slapping funny stuff. Nobody does it anymore, but the term's still with us. So again, I'll let you decide on that. Okay, another episode. John Marshall and Bushrod Washington, George's nephew, were Supreme Court justices and were on the way to see George at Mount Vernon. They knew George preferred neatness and cleanliness and timeliness. Being covered with dust from their travel, they stopped before reaching Mount Vernon to take a quick dip in the Potomac River, skinny dipping, and put on some fresh clothes so they would show up all spiffy and bright. When they got back to the carriage, their driver was embarrassed to tell them that at the previous night's stop, because they're taking these coaches and they'd stay at inns like the Cremerian or the Village Inn in Englishtown, he had accidentally picked up someone else's travel bags and left their own. The bags they picked up belonged to a peddler with only scraps of clothing in them. Rather than break out in anger, they started laughing. They're there with no clothes on. Their other clothes are dirty, maybe wet. They expected to put on all the fresh clothes they brought with them to impress George, and they got these scraps from the peddler's bag. While they were standing there buck naked, who should come riding up but General Washington, who every day would ride the circuit of his estates. He heard the laughing and came to see what was going on. John Marshall, who was actually here on this battlefield as a captain on this very hill during the battle, said, when the general saw the dilemma, he was so overcome by the ludicrousness of it of the two men that he actually rolled on the ground in merriment. Okay, is he really rolling on the ground, or is just a colloquial term? Okay, here's another John Marshall story. Washington and Marshall had gone into the country to visit some friends. They almost got there when Marshall's horse made a sudden movement and he split his pants. Ooh. Now, I remember once, if I may speak privately, back in 9th grade math class, somehow or other, I backed into a chalkboard and split my pants down the back. And I was embarrassed as hell and had to sit there until the whole class left, because I wasn't going to walk around with my pants split, as any of us, male or female, probably wouldn't want to do. But how do you get yourself out of that dilemma? So he's there with George, and it was getting late. It was too late to go back home to go get new breeches, and he was unpresentable, especially with ladies going to be present. So what should he do? Washington insisted on going on, so on they went. The only device to conceal this disastrous condition occurred to Marshall was to open a handkerchief and have it in front of him, because he split his pants in the front, as kind of like an apron. That looked kind of silly. On entering the room, Washington turned and looked at him and suddenly broke into an uncontrollable fit of laughter, which was so violent and exhausting that it was said he actually rolled on the floor and for a time could not recover himself. So there's 3 different episodes at 3 different times of George supposedly rolling on the floor. Again, did he, or is that just the saying? But I've gone too far on that. It does show he has humor. Even if he's not rolling on the floor or slapping his knee, he is laughing at situations. So I kind of suckered you into that, showing different examples of humor. It's like talking about Bigfoot. You start talking about Bigfoot, say, geez, does he have green eyes or blue eyes? And you spend all your time debating whether Bigfoot has green eyes or blue eyes, probably brown eyes, let alone saying, does Bigfoot even exist? But by talking about his colors of eyes, you've already conceded that he exists. So those are examples of Washington's humor. He was clearly more at ease at Mount Vernon, his home, where he could let his guard down. His humor can be seen partly in the names he chose for his hunting dogs. Tippler, True Love, Sweet Lips, Singer, Music, Trial, and Taster. Okay, people, I like military history. People think I would name my dog Napoleon or Caesar. Okay, no, I got Molly. So that shows a side of my, character, that you will name your dogs something that's pleasing to you. In 1785, the King of Spain sent George a prized jackass as a gift. The animal was so worn out by the sea voyage to America that he was not good for anything except eating. George named him Royal Gift. Okay, his humor. When Royal Gift scored to procreate with the broodmares he was supplied, he was going to use them for stud. George noted, the animal was too full of royalty to have anything to do with commoners. Once he told a visitor to Mount Vernon, toads can eat so many fireflies that their bellies will light up. That sounds like a Lincoln joke. Another one, during a dinner at Mount Vernon in 1798, the year before he died, the general learned that a duel had been fought between 2 New York politicians. He commented, they say the shot that one guy fired at the opponent cut a piece off his nose. How could he miss it? You know how big his nose was and what a good target that would have been. Okay, again, sounds like a Lincoln story. Okay, just a couple others, and then we'll sum up and leave some time for questions. This is possibly an entry from one of his diaries. During the war, one Sunday, he was in York, Pennsylvania. Now, what's cool is when the British captured Philadelphia, usually in European wars, if you capture the capital of the enemy country, the war's over. Napoleon captures Warsaw, Napoleon captures Berlin, the Allies captured Paris, the war's over. The British captured Philadelphia. By European standards, we should have been defeated. No. What did Congress do? Packed up and moved to York, Pennsylvania. Why? I don't know. I guess it puts 2 rivers, the Delaware and the Susquehanna, between I'm not sure if York's on the Susquehanna or not, but anyway, put some more distance between him and the British. Actually, the capital of the country for one season was Princeton. Congress was meeting in Nassau Hall in Princeton. They didn't move around. So he was in York, Pennsylvania. He could not find a church with an Episcopal minister because he's Episcopal. So he attended a church service at the local Dutch Reformed church. He said afterwards, the service being in that language, Dutch, not a word of which I understood, I was in no danger of becoming a convert to its religion because of the eloquence of the speaker. He just politely sat there and listened to the Dutch sermon. Valley Forge, General von Steuben, whose statue stands out here outside the museum. He was here at this battle. A company of soldiers was set up to show General Washington the new drill. Since von Steuben didn't speak English, he gave all his orders in German. Captain John Walker was charged with translating them into English. I've also heard the story that Steuben would say it in German, General Lafayette, who knew German, would put him into French, and Hamilton, who knew French, would put him into English. And that's how they trained the army. Captain Walker was charged at this instance of translating Steuben's German orders into English. Walker tried to explain to Steuben that he couldn't translate them all exactly. Steuben got mad. He told him to do as ordered. Steuben gave the orders. Walker translated to English, and somebody else then put them back into German. Steuben was puzzled and looked at General Washington. Then Lieutenant Colonel Tillman on George's staff explained why that was going on. Why was the officer translating Steuben's orders from Germans to English and then back to German? Because the company they were training was Pennsylvania Dutch soldiers that only spoke German. We had some of those in our army. So they had to put Steuben's orders back into German. The humor of the situation spread through the ranks and made the men start laughing. Washington was laughing too. Finally, von Steuben did. So maybe von Steuben had even less of a humor sense than General Washington. Okay, almost finished. After the victory at Yorktown in 1781, Washington and General Rochambeau gave a dinner for the defeated British general, because they were all being polite to each other. And Rochambeau offered the first toast to the United States. And Washington toasted the King of France. And Cornwallis said simply, the King. And Washington was puzzled, which one, maybe? And he added with a smile, of England. Let him keep himself there, and I will drink more. I'll throw in here the anecdote, if you don't mind, the source of it. I think this came from Lincoln, that somebody, when the American general was over in England visiting, and when he went to use the outhouse, the privy, there was a picture of General Washington in the outhouse. And the British had put it up there on purpose to show, like, haha, this is what we think of your general, by putting his picture up in the outhouse. And the general replied, no, I don't think that anything can make a British citizen excrement more than seeing a picture of George Washington. I think that's a Lincoln story. In 1788, when the Constitutional Convention was going on, a member made a motion that Congress should be restricted to a standing army not exceeding 5,000 men. Okay. General Washington, being the chairman, could not make a motion, but he told the delegate from Maryland to amend the motion that, yes, we will limit our army to 5,000 men, providing that no foreign enemy can invade the country with more than 3,000. That's humor of a different sort. Okay, so that's the end of my 23 stories with a couple add-ons. What do you think? Did Washington have a sense of humor? One historian wrote in 2015, Washington used his fine sense of humor to relieve the stress of those difficult times, enhance his leadership, and in a quiet and affable way, make the war effort go more smoothly. I don't think he proves his case. I think that's overwritten. I agree more with the historian named Donald Moran. General Washington obviously possessed a sense of humor, even if his contemporaries tried to conceal it from us. And I would add, even though Washington tried to conceal it from us, from editing it out of his papers in the 1780s, and Washington's secretary tried to conceal it from us by editing it out, and J.P. Morgan tried to conceal it from us by burning Washington's papers, that they wanted him to seem like a perfect man and not having, appreciating a dirty joke, to be blunt. Another account from that time, the Secretary of General von Steuben wrote, General Washington had a great deal of dry humor, which he knew how to make use of on the proper occasion. And he was known to relax, again, like when he's at Mount Vernon, or after a few glasses of wine. So I kind of agree more with that last account, that he had humor, it was a dry humor. James Madison wrote, the story is so often repeated of him never laughing. This was wholly untrue. This is President Madison, who was also here at this battle, by the way, as a captain on the staff over on Prime Hill. This is wholly untrue. No man seemed more to enjoy gay conversation, though he took little part in the conversation himself. He was a listener, not a talker. He was particularly pleased with the jokes, the good humor, and the humor of his companions. Again, he's more a listener than a talker. Okay, so I hope you feel about, when you learn something about George's humor, and especially the way biography worked in those days, and the image that he himself chose to project, and the image that others projected of him, and that you will feel the way Tom Corwin felt when the anecdote that President Lincoln told, when he heard Washington could swear on occasion, he was so pleased that George was addicted to vices and infirmities that he shouted for joy. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I'll be glad to answer questions about the talk, about the battle, or the battlefield, or whatever you want to throw at me. So, if not, that's fine also, or you can come up one by one. Okay, you feel edified? That's a big high school word. I teach in high school. It's interesting to look again at how biography, the nature of biography changes. And it's too bad a lot of these episodes of Washington's not only humor but anger got edited out, so we don't have them, but I think enough survive that we can see what was happening. And I still, if any of you ever come up with the reasoning on rolling on the ground in laughter, to see if other people really did that or it was just a saying. Okay, well, thank you all then. Thank you.